Okay, let's move to Idaho. They have a complete ban on abortion, essentially. And the Biden administration, in an attempt to at least have some leeway for women to get an abortion, even in those states that are not that have banned it, essentially reminded states that if you have a hospital that operates and receives Medicare money, which is just about every hospital in the country, that there is a provision there that emergency care must be given, if necessary, and that includes abortions, if a doctor deems that a woman is in a state of emergency. Now, in a practical terms, that's difficult because in the same way that these supposed exceptions in abortion laws are so vague that it puts doctors in a position where they're like, this is never a binary cut and dry thing. I'm going to have to go and make an argument that like a 60% emergency, a 50% emergency, a 70% emergency is a real emergency, or 30% or 40%, whatever. And I could lose my license. I could go to jail if I do this. So from a practical standpoint, it's a little bit secondary, but as a legal standpoint, this is the case that the Supreme Court is going to have to look at, right?
Yes, the Supreme Court has taken up this case and will decide exactly what federal law requires. I think you described the facts well. I would just say this statute says that hospitals have to provide stabilizing care to a patient in emergency distress to resolve their medical emergency. Idaho law, like a bunch of other abortion bans, says that you can't terminate a pregnancy until basically the patient is dying. They're either very close to death or very close to permanent impairment of organs or other major bodily functions, which is another way of describing close to death, right? So there's a delta between those two standards. You stabilize a patient before they're that close to death. And what the Biden administration is saying is, look, federal law is supreme over state law. So Idaho law might say you can't terminate a failing pregnancy until the patient is dying. But federal law says that you have to provide stabilizing care when they're in distress, but not yet at the point of death. So we think that federal law reigns supreme. The Constitution says so as well. And we think that it preempts any kind of state law, whether it's Idaho or Texas or some other red state, that forces women much closer to the brink of demise. A federal judge in Idaho agreed with the Biden administration. Different federal judges in Texas disagreed with the Biden administration. The Supreme Court has now stepped in and will resolve the case. A rather ominous sign, though, is that while doing that, the Supreme Court actually stayed the Idaho decision that had sided with the Biden administration. So for the past year plus, if you had a failing pregnancy in Idaho, you had a right to stabilizing care, including an abortion when necessary, because of this ruling. The Supreme Court just lifted that ruling, which means that Idaho law kicks back in, and you have to be much closer to the point of serious organ impairment or death before you can obtain emergency treatment. I am not optimistic about how this case will turn out at the Supreme Court. The signs are pretty bleak, but I guess hope springs eternal.
Can we just talk about how much BS is involved in the idea that you can stabilize someone on the brink of death? Like, I mean, what does that mean? Like, at what point? Like, I mean, if we just look at this, like, this is the whole fallacy of this whole thing, too, right? Like, when is someone about to fall off a cliff? Are they like, is it 1 foot over? Is it 90% of their body weight that is over that cliff? I mean, this is all subjective.
And if there's also this legal threat to the person who's supposed to pull you back from the cliff, that if they are not sufficiently close to falling off the cliff, that you could face literal prosecution or loss of your license if you don't let that percentage get a little high to meet that threshold.
Right. So this is the problem and vividly illustrated in Texas, which has a 99-year prison sentence for any doctor who provides an abortion that does not fall under the state's extremely narrow medical exception. Doctors are looking at patients coming in. They have infections. They are bleeding out. They have amniotic fluid leaking. Their pregnancies are clearly doomed. And the doctors say, look, I don't want to go to prison for 99 years, so I am legally obligated to wait until you develop sepsis or you are hemorrhaging before I can legally terminate that pregnancy. The state has come back and said, that's not true. These doctors are misreading the law. We would never pass a law like that. But then when Kate Cox actually went to court and said, I have a failing pregnancy, I am bleeding, I have amniotic fluid dripping down my legs, I need an abortion, the Texas Attorney General swiftly went to court to block her abortion and in fact issued a threat to every medical professional in the state of Texas and said, if you provide an abortion to Kate Cox, we will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law.
I wish you had better news for us, Mark, but it sort of feels like consistent with every conversation we've had for several years now.
Can I say one positive thing? One sort of positive
sure.
thing? I think that the Supreme Court will deny immunity to Trump in his criminal trial. This is something that I know you mentioned earlier. It's obviously a big topic. The Supreme Court doesn't seem to be in a huge rush, but I really do think there will be a lopsided majority vote to deny Trump immunity. And I think there's a real chance that that decision could come down with enough time for Trump to be held to a criminal trial in the District of Columbia. Not sure on that last part. The justices can certainly drag their feet when they want to, but this argument for immunity that Trump is making, I think the fact that he's making it so much and so strongly can give the impression that it has any kind of constitutional basis, but it doesn't. It's completely made up out of whole cloth. And even a conservative judge on the DC Circuit, Judge Karen Henderson, recognized that pretty clearly in oral arguments this morning. So, even though a lot of the news right now is bleak, these arguments that Trump's raising to try to scrap these trials altogether, I really don't think it'll hold. And I think even his own appointees on the Supreme Court will recognize that it's bogus.
Isn't it weird too, though, that Trump's lawyer said Kavanaugh is gonna save us? Does it? I mean, is it me, or is that like the worst thing you could possibly say going into a court case? Putting a specific justice on notice that, like, we expect because you got appointed by Trump that you're going to do what we want. Isn't that the way of basically making that judge go like, oh, geez, there's no way I can rule that way?
Yeah, I don't think that Trump's legal team are the best tacticians. I think that's become very clear in this latest round of litigation. They seem to think that that puts the pressure on Kavanaugh as if to say, remember who saved you, remember who you owe fidelity to. And I guess I would say I do think that Kavanaugh feels some sense of gratitude toward Trump for standing by him during Christine Blasey Ford's allegations of sexual misconduct. But Kavanaugh has this seat for life. He's still going to be there for 30 years. Sorry if that, makes you feel very bad inside. But he doesn't have to do anything for anyone. And so I am skeptical that that kind of statement or any other pressure is going to have any impact on how he decides this case.
That's what I would have thought. Unless, of course, it was Trump who paid off those bills that he had. But I don't think that's him.
Now he has access to the Leonard Leo piggy bank. He can get as much money to pay off his debts as he needs.
Exactly. Mark Joseph Stern, always a pleasure. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks, Emma.
Yep. Thanks, Mark.